Chapter 8. The Sandaway. Vesper ran to catch up to her aunt, her heart pounding as a torrent of power coursed through her blood. "What took you so long, child?" asked Magda, throwing her a sidelong glance. "Nothing," she said, hesitating, grateful that the dark hid her features. And her lie. Part of her still trembled from the warm tingle still in her belly from the energy of the Sandaway, her blood still racing from the surge of ace coursing through her. Falling in line beside her aunt, she gave the older woman a tight-lipped smile, wondering if she'd seen what Vesper had done even if she herself hadn't the faintest idea. It all had been wonderful, like waking from a pleasant dream or savoring the heat that lingered in her mouth after a good spicy meal. She was desperate to know more, but was frightened that her aunt would be angry with her if she found out, and forbid her outright from learning on her own, and that was the last thing she wanted. "I know when you lie, girl," said her aunt, confirming Vesper's fears, "and I know what you did. It was foolish and dangerous to play with power you don't understand. But we will discuss it later. For now, keep close to me, and don't do anything else so asinine." Vesper frowned at her aunt's back, pushing aside her worry. Magda knew the truth of what she did to the warrior, but now was not a good time for an argument. Their home was on fire, and hopefully, she would forget all this once the urgency passed. The village was laid out in a circle, with most of the homes on the outer ring, and the few shops and public spaces closer to the heart of it all. From what Vesper could see, the fire looked like it had started in the western end of town and was moving eastward, consuming everything in its path. Despite it all, her aunt thought it wise that they move slowly and keep to the shadows as they made their way toward the screams and shouts in the distance. "Hold," said her aunt, pulling Vesper against the wall of one of the huts they were passing. Her heart beat out of her chest as they fell back into the shadows, her ears and eyes straining to catch a hint of what her aunt had seen or heard. She flinched when a series of deep voices called out to one another in the strange Sandaway tongue, their guttural language resonating in the dark. "Follow, slowly, and not a sound," said her aunt, creeping ahead of her. Vesper nodded, slowly moving with her until they caught sight of a large group of Sandaway warriors running from house to house. "What kind of monsters are these?" she said, balling her fists when she saw them roughly pulling terrified people from their homes, then using torches that stunk of dung, to set fire to the thatched roofs. The large group of men were much like the others her aunt had fought. Stout, their faces painted white, with animal tusks strapped to the sides of their heads to make them appear demonic. "They are little more than beasts," said her aunt, her gaze never wavering. "And I will put them down like beasts." She followed the older woman's glare, cursing under her breath when she saw that some of the Sandaway tribesmen had captured a large group of women and children, shoving them onto their knees while they bound their hands and feet with rope. "What are they doing?" she asked in a harsh whisper, balling her hand into a fist when one of the white-faced warriors slammed the butt of his spear into a pregnant lady's belly. "Preparing them," said her aunt, anger flashing in her eyes. "They will be taken to market and sold as slaves." Vesper's brows came together and she made a face. "But they are not slaves, they are free people. How could they do such a thing? It is common for those taken in battle to be sold in such ways. No one questions it. The slavers are more than happy to pay, especially for women and small children." Vesper shook her head, gritting her teeth. "We can't let this happen. We must stop them. And yet you hesitated to kill the one we captured. I told you they would not show mercy to you or anyone else." "I didn't understand," Vesper said, her nostrils flaring with rage. "I didn't see them for what they were. But now, we must stop this. Before it's too late," she winced in sympathy when one of the Sandaway pulled a woman from her husband, kicking him to the dirt while he fought like a wild beast. A small boy, possibly his son, ran to cover the man's body, and the Sandaway turned their attention to him, lashing out with a heavy book that sent the boy reeling. A burning rage grew in her belly and Vesper surged forward, about to attack when her aunt put a restraining hand on her shoulder, shaking her head. "No! You will do nothing, you must look, learn. I will punish these men, show them what true cruelty is." "I will punish them," said her aunt, her face a mask of fury as she raised her hands. Vesper watched in awe as her aunt tugged at the weave, gathering stray threads of it in her hand ever so gently while she muttered harsh words under her breath, her voice echoing like a whisper and a shout all at once. With her final syllable, the air stilled, unmoving like the world was holding its breath. Then it all snapped back and a powerful surge of wind blasted through the dust-covered street, whipping up a stinging wave of dirt and grit that scoured over the Sandaway warriors, tearing at exposed skin while powerful gusts threw them off balance. Snarling in anger, her aunt raised her arms higher, pulling harder at the weave. Clumps of burning thatch and sod tore away from the burning huts, sending small balls of flame slamming into the bewildered warriors, setting their loose-fitting clothes on fire and sending most of them rolling onto the ground in a pitiful attempt to douse out the flames. To Vesper's amazement, the wind and flames never touched the men and women of the village, avoiding them completely. "Now, take this," said her aunt, shoving the spear she had taken from the other Sandaway into her hands. "I will deal with these fools, but if anyone manages to come near you, poke him with the sharp end. And Vesper, this time, do not hesitate." "Yes, Auntie," she said, baring her teeth with a snarl. Her aunt did as before, wading into the fallen group of warriors without fear, arming herself with one of their own fallen weapons. This time a crescent-shaped, iron sword with a wickedly sharp tip. The older woman didn't hesitate, slashing and stabbing at the blinded and burning Sandaway without mercy, the heavy blade in her hand cutting through bone and flesh like a scythe. It was over before it began, and within moments her aunt was standing over the bodies of a dozen men, bloody sword in hand, her chest heaving. Vesper narrowed her eyes, feeling like a veil had been lifted and she was seeing Magda the first time. The soft matronly woman who comforted her when she had a bad dream, or cleaned her cuts and scrapes when she fell, was gone, replaced by an otherworldly creature brimming with power, an avenger who protected her people with every ounce of her being, cutting down her enemies with vicious efficiency. The women and children that her aunt had just saved raced to thank her, reaching out with trembling hands to touch her with wide-eyed reverence. Magda held up the bloody sword, stopping them in their tracks with an intense stare. "Go," she said in a tone that brooked no argument, waving them off. "Hide in the fields until the sun returns. We will find you once it is safe, and for the love of Olajume and all that is righteous, stay out of sight." The small group clutched at their children, bowing their heads gratefully as they ran off into the night on silent steps. "Come now, Vesper, we must hurry, time is short. Do they not know what they are doing is wrong? How can they live with themselves?" she asked, looking at the twisted bodies of the fallen warriors. "With the Sandaway, it is impossible to know. They are wicked and corrupt, more beast than man. But the truth is that they have always preferred to fight than work, and when their harvests are poor, they raid those who do what they cannot." Vesper frowned as if she'd tasted something bitter, shaking her head in disgust. "We are all cut from the same cloth," she began, "our struggles are the same as theirs. Why would they do that to their neighbors? To women and children just trying to eke out another day." Magda shook her head, giving Vesper a sidelong glance as they moved on, returning to the shadows while quickening their pace. The Sandaway were the first to discover the weave. They were the first people Olajume created and gifted with power, and they think themselves above all others and see us as little more than animals. But from the beginning they were flawed, broken creatures, incapable of love and empathy, driven only by a lust for power, and so after a time Olajume moved on, abandoning his original creations in favor of us. Vesper balked, shaking her head. Yes, but to steal someone's life, their freedom, it's monstrous, inhumane. Yes, when Olajume abandoned them they lost access to the weave, and in their hunger for power they looked too deep into the darkness beyond the veil of the weave, and what they found stole what little good was left in them. Vesper's thoughts flew back to the gaping holes in the weave, those dark places that called to her, drawing her deep into the void when she was trying to find her mother among its vast tapestry. What did they find? She asked in a hushed tone. Magda shrugged. No one knows for sure. To do so would risk suffering the same fate, but it's one of the reasons that the O's exist, the reason God gave us power. The chosen are meant to serve as a bulwark, to hold back what lies beyond the void. How are we supposed to protect the world if we don't know what we are protecting it from? Magda began to answer, but her eyes went wide and she charged toward Vesper, down. She screamed, slamming into her without warning and pushing her roughly aside, sending Vesper careening down into the dirt, her hands scraping against the rough stone. Clenching her teeth at the pain, she rolled over, scanning the darkness for threats. She was about to spring to her feet when her aunt let out a haunting shriek, her back arching as a Sandaway spear pierced her chest. The weapon went clean through, coming out her back and spraying Vesper's face with flecks of warm blood. For a moment she didn't believe it was real, that it was some sort of trick, but the pain etched on Magda's face brought the stark reality into place. Shaking off her panic, Vesper rushed to catch her, just as a Sandaway warrior emerged from the shadows. The warrior's demonic face split into a predatory grin as he stalked toward her, and a hunger appeared in his cold eyes when he saw her. No. Vesper whispered, a lump forming in the pit of her stomach when the painted warrior stepped over her aunt's still form. He planted his foot on her chest, and brutally pulled his spear from her body, the sickening sound of bone and muscle tearing filling the air. A hollow rattle escaped her aunt's throat and blood spilled from her mouth, which opened and closed in a silent scream. The Sandaway warrior looked up from her aunt's still form, locking his horrid gaze on her, and Vesper scrambled back, fighting the urge to turn and run. Hefting his bloody spear he took a single step toward her, tilting his head like he was seeing her for the first time. Vesper knew she could jump away, vanishing along the lines of the tapestry to somewhere far away from this nightmare. But if there was even a chance that her aunt was still alive, she wouldn't leave. She had to know. The Sandaway came fully into the light as he stalked toward her, and Vesper's breath caught in her throat. He was different from the others. His face was still marked with streaks of white paint, and the horns on the sides of his head were the same. He walked hunched over, moving more like a beast than a man, sniffing at her like a wild dog with the scent of prey in his nose. The strangest part of him was the blank, unblinking stare he gave her. Now that he was closer, she could see his pupils were covered with a strange milky film as if he were blind, but by the way he followed her, she was sure he knew exactly where she was. "Hush, hush, little O's, don't cry," he began in an accent so thick she could hardly make out his words. "You are a fine jam, and you will fetch a fine price, more if you're undamaged. So come with Papa Jufari, and I promise you will be treated well in my care until you are sold." Vesper swallowed hard, trying to keep the tremble from her voice. "No," she said, "you'll have to kill me." "Oh no, that would be wasteful." You smells of good juju. Raw and untouched. A fine price we get for you. I will see you get a kind master, he said, sniffing at her again and then cocking his head, like something had just occurred to him. Maybe even keep you for me. Scrambling to her feet without taking her eyes off him, Vesper stepped back on legs that felt like rubber, her body shaking so hard she had to put a trembling hand on the wall of the hut to keep from falling. Please, just let me go, she said, shaking her head as tears rolled down her face. And give up such a prize, no. Come, time to be off. Like a hunting cat he pounced toward her, covering the distance between them in an instant. Vesper braced herself, flailing at his shoulders and face with feeble blows that only made his smile widen. Batting aside her attacks, he laughed at her like a grinning hyena, slapping her with the back of his hand so hard she saw stars, her mouth filling with the taste of blood. Then, as if she were a small child, he scooped her up like she weighed nothing, ignoring her feeble attacks, and throwing her over his shoulder. Seeing her aunt laying unmoving in the dirt, Vesper fought like a cornered animal, flailing against his back and clawing at his skin, fighting with every ounce of her strength to break away or at least slip off him, but his grip was like iron, and his shoulders and back were harder than stone, leaving Vesper's hands bloody and raw. Please, we can't just leave her here, she begged, exhaustion making her limbs go weak. Oh, that flesh is nothing no more. Cast off clay, Papa Jufari said, shaking his head, the spark be returned to the weave, no sense in crying, save your tears for the living. She looked up at the sky to find the thread that was her aunt's life cut, dangling, her image dim. Vesper shrieked like her heart had been torn out, her belly suddenly hollow. Her aunt had been her whole world, the one constant in her life. And now she was gone like she had never been, cut down trying to protect her. In that moment she stopped fighting against the Sandaway, her entire body falling limp as she stared at her aunt's corpse, trying to hold back the wave of guilt boiling up from her soul. This had been her fault. If only she had paid attention, had listened. Her aunt would still be here, to teach her about what she was meant to do, to teach her all the things her mother would have taught her. Teach her about life. Time to go, said the Sandaway, pulling her mind away from the grief that threatened to crush her soul. Shifting her on his shoulders, he stood to his full height. Papa Jufari, take you home now. From the sheath on his hip he pulled out a bone dagger, bleached white by the sun and covered in strange circular symbols. The strange instrument was bent and twisted, looking like it had been gnawed on by some hungry beast, and was topped with black feathers and colored beads dangling from its hilt. For a moment Vesper braced herself, thinking he was going to stab her with it. Instead he began to sing under his breath, his tone surprisingly soft yet deep. You hold on tight now, he said as the light around them dimmed like the sun being eclipsed. A cold wind blew over her, raising gooseflesh, and making her teeth clatter, and without warning they were somewhere else, somewhere dark where even the sound of her breathing was muted, sounding far away. She swore under her breath as she looked around. The village, the fire, even her aunt's body were all gone, and she found herself along a dark cobblestone path that branched off into the dark. Where are we? She asked, flinching at the hollow sound of her voice. The Sandaway smiled at her, his grin making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Papa Jufari full of old tricks. He know the old ways, the way home that no one can see and no one follow. But don't worry, you stick close and you be safe. Lots of stuff in the dark, best to stay on the path. Taking a look around, Vesper had no idea where she was, but looking down at the monster of a man who had taken her, she knew she had to get away. Calming herself, she tried to focus on the weave, intending to grab hold of the lines of ice that connected all places and things and jump home to her aunt, to her people. But with a gasp she realized there was nothing there. There were no softly glowing threads, no plants to provide her with the power, only darkness, and Papa Jufari humming softly under his breath.